He weighed less than a jockey. He stood 5'4" in his boots, and for over a decade, grown men lined up to kick him into the mud. That's not an exaggeration. That's a Tuesday for Jimmy Johnstone. Small man. Ginger hair. Feet that made defenders look like they were running through wet cement. And a target on his back the size of Hampton Park, because in the era Johnstone played, there was no protection for a player like him. No yellow card after 2 bad tackles. No VR review. If you wanted to stop the little winger, you just stopped him. However you had to. So today, we're not doing a highlight reel. Highlight reels are easy. Anyone can cut together 40 seconds of a man dribbling past 3 defenders and call it genius. What's harder, what actually tells you who a player was, is the list of people who tried to break him. The ones who came at him with talent, with malice, with tactics, with politics, and in one case, with something close to a full-scale ambush. 7 of them. 7 forces that came for Jimmy Johnstone across his career. Some fair. Some anything but. By the end, you'll understand why teammates still talk about him with something close to reverence, and why the story doesn't end where you think it does. Let's set the scene properly first. Jimmy Johnstone broke through at Celtic in the early 1960s, a Glasgow kid with close control that looked less like coaching and more like a party trick nobody could explain. By the time Celtic were assembling the squad that would go on to shock the entirety of European football, Johnstone wasn't a squad player. He was the plan. Jock Stein built entire matches around getting the ball to the right winger and letting him do what defenders couldn't stop. The numbers back it up. Across his time at Celtic, Johnstone won league titles in bulk, cup after cup, and was a first-choice starter in the run that made Celtic the first British club to lift the European Cup, in 1967. That squad became known as the Lisbon Lions, and Johnstone was one of the sharpest teeth in it. This wasn't a mascot who got lucky. This was a player team spent entire training sessions trying to nullify, and mostly failed. Which is exactly why the list we're about to go through exists. You don't build a 7-man rogues gallery around a squad player. You build it around a genuine problem, someone opposing managers lost sleep over. So here's how this works. We're counting down 7 names, 7 forces, each one testing Johnstone in a completely different way. Fair competition. Ugly violence. Institutional politics. Tactical genius. And one moment of chaos so extreme it's still talked about in Scottish football folklore under its own nickname. Stick around, because by the end of this list, you'll understand that being written off as too small was maybe the least accurate scouting report in the history of the sport. Let's start with the one entry on this list that isn't really about cruelty. It's about a man who simply had Johnstone's number, fair and square, and that's almost more painful to admit. Terry Cooper was Leeds United's left-back during their brutally efficient Don Revie years, and when Celtic met Leeds in the semi-final of the 1970 European Cup, Cooper was tasked with the impossible: stop Johnstone. What made Cooper dangerous wasn't a rough style. It was the opposite. He was quick enough to match Johnstone's turns, and disciplined enough not to dive into the tackles that got other defenders booked or beaten. Across the 2 legs, Cooper read Johnstone's body shape better than almost anyone else managed to that season, forcing the winger into areas where his usual tricks lost their teeth. Celtic still progressed to the final, largely on other players' contributions, but the tie is remembered as one of the rare occasions where a fullback genuinely won his individual battle against Johnstone over 90 minutes, home and away. No niggling fouls needed. No histrionics. Just better positioning and better timing than almost anyone else who ever tried. It's the kind of defeat that should sting more than the ones that follow it, because there was no villain to point at. Just a very good defender, on a very good day, doing his job properly. Now we move from fair competition into something rougher. If Terry Cooper represents the exception, this next entry represents the rule. Old Firm derbies, Celtic against Rangers, have never been polite affairs, and in Johnstone's era, they were closer to trench warfare with a football rolling somewhere in the middle. Davy Provan, a combative Rangers defender, became one of the recurring names Johnstone had to face across derby after derby, and the treatment wasn't subtle. Reducers early in the game. Off-the-ball shoves. The occasional tackle that arrived a half-second after the ball had already gone. This wasn't personal animosity so much as it was simply what wingers like Johnstone were subjected to across the entire British game at the time. Referees of the period were reluctant to send players off for what would now draw automatic red cards, and physical intimidation was treated less like foul play and more like part of the tactical furniture. Provan and players like him understood the equation perfectly: if you can't outskill Jimmy Johnstone, you make every touch of the ball cost him something physically. What's remarkable is how rarely it worked. Johnstone kept getting back up, kept demanding the ball again, kept going at the same fullback a second and third time in the same half. It built him a reputation that went beyond skill, durability. In an era with essentially no protection, that durability was its own kind of statement. Here's where the list stops being about opponents and turns inward, because sometimes the biggest threat to a career isn't the other team. It's your own dressing room. Jock Stein adored Johnstone as a footballer. That part was never in question. But Stein was also famously strict about discipline, and Johnstone, off the pitch, was chaos, nights out, late arrivals, the kind of behavior that gave a manager migraines. Stein's response, more than once, was severe. There are accounts of Stein disciplining Johnstone in ways that went beyond a simple fine or a dropped place in the team, moments where the manager made it brutally clear that talent alone wouldn't shield a player from consequences. The tension between the two men wasn't really about dislike. It was about fear. Stein had seen gifted players waste careers through exactly the kind of behavior Johnstone kept drifting toward, and his harshness came from trying to protect an asset he considered close to irreplaceable. Johnstone, for his part, seemed to need that boundary as much as he resented it. Every time Stein came down hard, Johnstone responded on the pitch, almost as if proving the discipline hadn't broken anything. It's an uncomfortable entry on a list like this, because the conflict isn't clean. There's no villain here, just two strong-willed men, one trying to build a legacy and the other trying not to burn his own down. This is where the story shifts from individuals to something bigger, an institution that, depending on who you ask, simply never trusted Johnstone with the responsibility his talent demanded. Scotland's national side during this period wasn't run the way modern international squads are. Team selection in the earlier part of Johnstone's international career was, at points, influenced by a selection committee rather than a single manager with full authority, and that structure produced some baffling calls. Johnstone, despite being arguably the most dangerous attacking talent Scotland had, was in and out of the side, occasionally overlooked in favour of players considered more reliable or easier to build a system around. There's a frustrating logic buried in that word, reliable. It usually meant predictable. Manageable. A player who wouldn't do something a committee couldn't script for. Johnstone, dazzling and unpredictable by nature, didn't fit that mold, and it cost him caps that a player of his ability should never have had to fight for. This is the entry on the list where the opposition wasn't a person at all. It was a system, cautious, bureaucratic, allergic to risk, that undervalued exactly the quality that made Johnstone worth watching in the first place. Sound familiar? It should. Football's relationship with its most gifted mavericks has rarely been comfortable, then or now. Now we get to tactics. Real, suffocating, borderline scientific tactics, and this is the entry that should terrify anyone who thinks Johnstone's story is only about brute force. In the 1970 European Cup final, Celtic faced Feyenoord, managed by Ernst Happel, one of the sharpest tactical minds of his generation. Happel didn't try to beat Johnstone with a single tough-tackling fullback the way most British teams did. He built a structural trap, a rotating, zonal setup designed to close down space the instant Johnstone received the ball, funneling him toward crowded areas rather than the open flank he thrived in. It worked. Not because Johnstone suddenly lost his skill, but because for the first time in the tournament, he was facing a team that had actually done its homework at a systemic level rather than relying on individual battles. Feyenoord won the final in extra time, and while there were several factors in that result, the way Happel's setup managed to strangle Celtic's most explosive outlet was a genuine tactical masterclass, proof that sometimes the most dangerous opponent isn't the toughest defender. It's the smartest manager in the building. For Johnstone, it must have been a strange kind of frustration. Not beaten by violence. Not beaten by an institution. Beaten by a chess player who simply saw the board 3 moves ahead. What made it worse was that there was no single defender to point at afterward, nobody to single out as the man who'd stopped him. The whole system had stopped him. Happel's Feyenoord side pressed as a unit, recovered shape as a unit, and closed passing lanes as a unit, which meant that even when Johnstone did get a half-yard of space, there was rarely a teammate free to receive the pass before the shape reset around him again. It's the kind of defeat that doesn't produce a villain for a highlight reel narrative, and maybe that's exactly why it doesn't get talked about as often as the more violent entries on this list, even though, tactically, it might be the single most impressive feat of containment Johnstone ever faced. If Feyenoord represents the intellectual extreme of stopping Johnstone, this next entry is the polar opposite, and it's ugly. Celtic's clash with Atletico Madrid in the 1974 European Cup is remembered as one of the most violent ties in the competition's history. Atletico's approach that night went well past physical, aggressive football and into deliberate, repeated fouling designed to intimidate and injure rather than simply defend. Multiple Celtic players were targeted, and Johnstone, as one of the team's most dangerous attacking threats, was a prime target for exactly that treatment. The match spiraled into chaos, with players sent off and the game descending into something closer to a brawl with a ball occasionally involved than a football match. It wasn't Johnstone against one defender anymore. It was Johnstone, and every teammate around him, absorbing an approach that had clearly been planned before kickoff as a strategy rather than a heat-of-the-moment loss of discipline. This is the entry that shows just how far some opponents were willing to go, not to outskill Johnstone, but to physically remove the threat he posed by any means necessary, rules be damned. Now, let me be fair for a second, because it's easy to make this whole list sound like Johnstone spent his career as a helpless victim wandering into ambush after ambush. He wasn't. He gave as good as he got in terms of skill, he had a stubborn streak that refused to be intimidated, and plenty of the games on this list, Celtic still won. This isn't a sob story. It's closer to a resume, proof of exactly how much resistance it took to stop him, and how often it still didn't work. Alright. Fairness over. Because entry number 1 isn't just the most chaotic item on this list, it's one of the most notorious matches in the history of Scottish football, full stop, and it dwarfs everything else you've heard so far, combined. Everything up to this point on the list has been isolated. One rival. One derby opponent. One manager. One committee. One tactical setup. One violent opponent. This final entry is different, because it wasn't one match, one incident, or one opponent. It was an entire series, engineered from the first whistle to the last, and it stands apart from everything else on this list for exactly that reason. In 1967, fresh off winning the European Cup, Celtic faced Racing Club of Argentina in the Intercontinental Cup, a 3-match series meant to crown a genuine world champion between Europe and South America. What actually happened was closer to a demolition derby with jerseys. The tie descended into something historians still refer to by its own nickname, the Battle of Montevideo, after the deciding match, played in Uruguay, turned into one of the most violent, chaotic games ever sanctioned at that level. Racing's approach wasn't built around one hard man assigned to shut down one winger. It was closer to what's now sometimes described as rotational fouling, different players taking turns committing fouls against the same target, spacing the offenses out across multiple men so no single player accumulated enough cautions to be sent off before the damage was done. Johnstone, as one of Celtic's most electric attacking threats, was directly in the firing line of exactly that strategy. Across the tie, the physical treatment aimed at neutralizing him escalated match by match, and by the final game, the entire fixture had unraveled into a level of violence and provocation that led to multiple players being sent off on both sides. Johnstone himself was dismissed during the chaos, swept up in a match that had stopped resembling organized football and started resembling something closer to a street fight that occasionally paused for a corner kick. It wasn't confined to one flashpoint either. Across the 90 minutes, the game was stopped repeatedly as officials tried and failed to regain control. Players from both sides squared up off the ball, and what should have been a showcase of two continents' best football turned into a spectacle that football historians still cite as a low point for the sport at that level. The first two legs had already been tense and combative, but it was the decider in Montevideo where things fully collapsed, with the disciplinary record from that single match standing as one of the most extreme in the competition's history. Racing Club won the series and were crowned world champions, but the manner of that win became the actual headline. It wasn't remembered as a footballing triumph. It was remembered as a cautionary tale about exactly how far an opponent could go when the target was dangerous enough, and the enforcement around them was weak enough, to make brutality look like strategy. For Johnstone, it's the single clearest example on this entire list of what it meant to be a genuine, sustained threat in that era of football. Not one bad tackle. Not one bitter rival. An entire opposing setup, engineered match after match, purely to stop one small winger from doing what he did better than almost anyone alive. 7 names. 7 completely different tests. A fair rival who simply had his number. Routine derby brutality. A manager who loved him enough to discipline him hard. A national selection system too cautious to trust his unpredictability. A tactical genius who solved him with structure instead of violence. An opponent who tried to solve him with violence instead of structure. And finally, an entire team engineered around wearing him down by any means available, in a match still remembered by its own grim nickname decades later. That's not a highlight reel. That's a resume written in bruises.